In our last video, we talked about generally how to lay out a dungeon. In this one, we're going to talk about some of the things that you might put into your dungeon, in particular things that make it more of a living environment and less of a static space that you simply walk through. This video has been sponsored by Dark World Studio and the recent Kickstarter game, Acheron. Acheron is a 1930s era grimpunk tabletop role-playing game where you must sacrifice your humanity to fight against the evils of the world. Its setting describes a 1930s horror-focused world, though not our world, with influences from Lovecraft, the SCP Foundation, The Witcher, and Dishonored. Its gameplay focuses on authentic player choices, gritty combat, simplified realism, and character-altering consequences. It also includes a dynamic sanity system, unique races, and a free-form progression system. One thing that stood out to me about this project was its focus on realism and on making character choices matter. Rushing into combat will get you killed quickly. Armor, cover, and careful planning are critical to success, which is something that I like quite a bit. To check out this project for yourself, head down to the description below and click the link to their Kickstarter. The first thing to think about when setting up a dungeon that feels like a living environment is to have wandering monsters. Now, this is something that I've discussed a number of times in the past at length, so I'm not going to go into too much depth here. You can watch my previous video on that topic if you'd like to. But to briefly summarize, what you want is just a list of different types of creatures or possible threats that could show up if the players linger too long or make too much noise. This helps to make the dungeon feel like a place with its own ecology and with its own rules. It also takes things a little bit out of the DM's hands so that even they are a little bit surprised by the things that show up, and it makes the game a little bit more engaging. On top of this, you can add on the reaction roll, where whenever you encounter a monster, if it's not obvious how it would react, you can roll a die to randomize its personality as regards the player characters. This can result in monsters that are possibly friendly or at least neutral, allowing for different kinds of encounters other than simply combat ones. The second thing to think about is related to the wandering monster table, and that is monster evidence. What I like to do is to take my wandering monster table and add some bits of evidence on there so that when you're rolling on it, you could come across just a clue that a monster was there recently or is nearby rather than running into one directly. This gives players more information about the dungeon, and it gives them important choices to make. Do they want to quickly head in the opposite direction? Do they want to try and sneak up on this thing that was just here a second ago? What do they want to do, right? New choices are immediately presented to them, and the dungeon becomes more interesting. Examples of evidence that they might leave behind could be anything from graffiti to things like tracks they've left behind, perhaps bloody tracks if they've just killed something, perhaps the carcass of a recent kill. That you could do things like the remains of a campsite, if it was the type of monster that would have a camp, or even droppings that it's left behind if it's a more monstrous sort of creature. The third thing to think about is the descriptions of the upcoming rooms in a dungeon. It's too frequent where you have decision points in dungeons. You need to go left or go right, and both directions are essentially identical. The players might as well just flip a coin to decide which way to go, which is really no fun. What you want to do is add some sort of evidence or information so that the choice is meaningful. So think about the five senses here. You can add sounds coming from one direction or another, maybe the sound of flowing water, or perhaps the sounds of monsters talking. You could add the scent of food cooking or the scent of something rotten. You could add the sight of firelight just around the corner, giving the evidence that maybe there's a campfire down there. You could even add things like architectural styles, where you have a sense of the kind of section of the dungeon or the zone that you're entering and what might be down there. Anything that players aren't just making a random decision is going to add a lot more enjoyability and a lot more engagement in your dungeon. The fourth thing is someone to talk to in the dungeon. This gives players that are more socially oriented something to do, and it can be a welcome break from the terror and claustrophobia of walking through these dark corridors. NPCs in the dungeon also add another way for players to gain information about their environment. And you also really want to make them a fully fleshed out person. Give them their own personalities, their own quirks, their own goals, anything to help them stick in the player's mind, and so that they treat them like a real person rather than just, a person with an exclamation point over their head giving out quests. One other trick is to make sure that the NPCs in the dungeon actually have relationships to one another. This makes it feel more like a real place with its own history. So you can add things like one NPC hates another, or perhaps respects another, or to even add more dynamism, is hunting or has escaped from another, or was enslaved by one of them, or is serving one of them. This creates a web of relationships that turns the whole dungeon into a semi-social environment. You do have to think about what kind of NPCs would be in a dungeon, especially a dungeon that's populated with a lot of dangerous creatures. So you got to think of an excuse for why it makes sense that they're there. So this could be something anywhere from they're so powerful that no one else wants to threaten them. It could be that they're being protected by a group of monsters there, or maybe they're the leader of a particular faction. It could be that they are so useful to everyone in the dungeon that no one wants to threaten them. Or it could be even something as simple as it's a ghost and no one really can hurt them and they're just waiting for someone to talk to. Number 5, and this is something I mentioned just a second ago, factions. Factions are a huge element of making dungeons feel alive. They're basically NPCs, but just writ on a much larger scale. By giving them their own personalities, their own flaws, and setting up relationships between more than one faction, you've set the stage for large-scale conflict and the ability for PCs to really influence the dynamics within the dungeon. Factions offer the opportunity for longer-term consequences than you typically see in dungeons. This is especially true if the factions extend outside of the dungeon. The best way to set up factions in a dungeon, in my opinion, is to have a kind of tenuous ceasefire that's ongoing as the players enter the dungeon. This allows for the PC's activity to tip the scales in one direction or another, which gives them another point of leverage and allows them to influence things much more directly. This is the tack that the Dark of Hot Springs Island books take, even though that's an island hex crawl. But it works just as well in dungeons, especially if it's a large dungeon, as it would in the overworld. That being said, if you prefer your factions in the dungeon to be in a state of all-out warfare, that can be a lot of fun too. Number 6, add rival NPC parties to your dungeon. This is one of the most fun elements to add to any D&D adventure. Give them their own thematic elements, their own aesthetics, their own favored tactics, their own personalities, their own catchphrases. It can be a lot of fun. It can really get the PCs riled up, especially if you can get them to hate this other group who is always just behind them or perhaps just in front of them on their goal to get whatever treasure lies in the dungeon. They offer the opportunity for these different parties to team up with each other to defeat large enemies or perhaps betray each other at just the last moment. They can have the different factions and get the factions to turn on the opposite party. You can race the opposing party to an objective. You can fight them in an arena. There are so many possibilities here. Number 7, events and activities. So for example, if this is an Elven King's Fortress, perhaps there is a whole feast going on throughout all of the different rooms that players are going to have to navigate. If it's a Dwarven fortress, there's a lot of mining going on. Perhaps the dragon in the dungeon is holding court, and all of the other monsters present are there to pay him homage in some way. Or perhaps, as mentioned before, it's just a situation of all-out warfare. Regardless of what theme you choose, this can make things a lot easier on the DM because it makes it very intuitively obvious why all of the different monsters are there and what they're up to. Number 8, countdowns and escalations. So being in a dungeon is mostly a game of resource management, but you can turn this up as the game goes on by adding some sort of threat level that increases the longer that they stay. This can be a kind of smooth escalation, like the dungeon slowly filling with water or sand, or perhaps the whole thing crumbling away. Or perhaps you could do it in more stages, where maybe there is an alert level, and every once in a while the alarm level goes up, and the types of creatures that the players encounter are more dangerous or more numerous. Alternatively, you could have it structured like a countdown, where the players are racing to accomplish some goal in a limited amount of time before something really bad happens. Perhaps that there is a cult that's summoning a major demon, and it's going to happen in 20 turns. Can you get there in time? Number 9, side quests. You can add these after the players enter the dungeon or even before, but the goal here is to add more variety and to give them an excuse to poke around in the dungeon and see how everything fits together. A good side quest is a kind of bonus mission that players can optionally undertake for an extra reward at the cost of extra risk. You can hand them out through NPCs or even things like scraps of paper or maps that were left behind by other adventurers. Good examples of side quests include things like collectibles, where perhaps you have a magic item that's in multiple parts and you need to find them throughout the dungeon and put them together in order to unlock its power. It could be things like negotiating a truce between warring factions or NPCs. It could even be something as simple as new information that they discover about a location that they've previously visited in the dungeon, giving them an excuse to backtrack and explore and discover that area in a new way. Number 10 is interactivity. Give players a way to manipulate the dungeon to their own ends. Give them buttons to push. Give them ways to turn their environment against their enemies. What I've discovered in running D&D is that there is an entire type of player whose whole goal is just to pull the lever. And I really believe in structuring dungeons to accommodate that kind of person. Good examples of this might be traps that you can intentionally activate in order to take out your enemies, or perhaps alarms that you can set off elsewhere in the dungeon in order to draw them away. You can do stuff like finding that one really dangerous creature that's been chained up the bottom of the dungeon and intentionally releasing it in order to unleash havoc throughout the dungeon. Or perhaps finding the self-destruct button that collapses the whole place behind you as you run for safety. So those are my 10 tips for making your dungeon a more interactive, living environment. Give your players information. Allow them to make good choices. Give them people to talk to. Give them ways to sink their claws into the setting and tear it apart from the inside if they can. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.